Let's jump right into this explainer and unpack the massive legal ripples created by Luigi Mangione's recent federal guilty plea. When a high-profile case crosses state and federal lines, the legal mechanics can get incredibly tangled. Today we're looking objectively at the facts surrounding the criminal proceedings against Mangione for the tragic death of UnitedHealthcare Chief Executive Brian Thompson. Specifically, we're going to zero in on the fascinating and honestly somewhat unusual procedural divide that has just opened up between the federal courts and the state of New York.
This brings us to the absolute central mystery we're exploring today. How exactly does pleading guilty in a federal court impact pending state murder allegations? Now, you might assume that once a person pleads guilty to a crime, the entire legal book is closed, right? Well, in the American legal system, that is absolutely not the case. We're dealing with overlapping jurisdictions, competing statutes, and entirely separate court systems that are essentially running right alongside each other.
To keep everything crystal clear, we're going to untangle this jurisdictional knot step by step, looking at the August federal plea, diving into the specifics of that federal case, checking out New York's pending charges, unpacking the whole double jeopardy fight, touching on the Pennsylvania charges, and finally, looking at what happens next.
Section 1. The August federal plea, resolving the guilt phase.
We have to start in the Southern District of New York. On August 14, 2026, the guilt phase of Mangione's federal prosecution was completely resolved. Appearing before U.S. District Judge Margaret M. Garnett, Mangione entered what's called an open guilty plea to 2 specific stalking counts, admitting to the conduct that tragically caused the death of Brian Thompson. Now, an open plea just means there was absolutely no negotiated agreement with the government to lock in a specific sentence beforehand. During this proceeding, he admitted to using deceptive communications, manufacturing a firearm and a silencer, and shooting Thompson. But it's really vital to note what he actually pleaded guilty to here. These are federal stalking offenses that carry an enhanced penalty specifically because death resulted.
Section 2. The federal case explained. Stalking versus firearms.
It's really important to clarify what's actually left in this federal case. As you can see, a highly technical ruling back in January 2026 on the definition of a crime of violence actually removed the federal death penalty from the equation. Judge Garnett dismissed 2 firearm counts because, under a very strict, categorical approach required by Supreme Court precedent, the underlying stalking statutes just didn't automatically qualify as crimes of violence. Now, to be clear, the ruling didn't mean the conduct wasn't violent. It was purely a matter of statutory interpretation. So as a result, the death penalty is off the table federally, but Mangione still faces a maximum penalty of life imprisonment without parole for each of those surviving stalking counts.
So, when does the federal book close for good? Well, Judge Garnett has scheduled the federal sentencing for December 18, 2026, though we don't have a specific start time set just yet. The prosecution has made it clear they intend to ask for life imprisonment, calculating an advisory range of 292 to 365 months, but ultimately, the final sentence is entirely up to the judge. This December date is going to finalize his federal punishment, but, and this is key, it does not by itself decide what happens to the state charges.
Moving right along to Section 3. New York's pending charges, the unresolved allegations.
Over in New York Supreme Court, we need to be incredibly precise about where things stand. Mangione remains an accused defendant who's pleaded not guilty to these entirely separate state charges. This is all happening in New York County, Part 32, before Justice Gregory Caro. While 2 terrorism-related counts were dismissed back in September 2025 for being legally insufficient, these 9 remaining allegations are completely unresolved. It's a fundamental tenet of our justice system that these are just allegations right now. There has been no trial and no guilty plea in the state of New York. Mangione is facing 1 count of second-degree murder, several weapons possession counts in varying degrees, and a forged instrument count.
And as New York prepares for a potential trial, they've really had to hammer out what evidence can actually be shown to a jury. Justice Caro issued a highly specific evidence ruling in May 2026, and it's so vital to remember that these state evidence rules do not automatically control the federal case. For instance, the state court suppressed items found during an initial, warrantless backpack search at a McDonald's in Pennsylvania. Things like a magazine, cell phone, and passport. However, evidence recovered during a later, valid station house inventory search, like the firearm, the alleged silencer, and a red notebook, those were admitted. Interestingly enough, the federal court actually allowed all the backpack evidence. It just perfectly illustrates how incredibly jurisdiction-specific these legal battles are.
Which brings us to Section 4, the double jeopardy fight, state versus federal power.
This is literally the heart of today's explainer. On August 14th, right after the federal plea, the defense filed a motion to dismiss the New York case entirely.
To understand their argument, we first have to look at the U.S. Constitution. Under the Constitution's dual sovereignty doctrine, New York technically has the absolute power to run its own prosecution. Because the federal government and state governments are considered separate, independent sovereigns, the federal double jeopardy clause doesn't stop New York from charging someone for the exact same conduct that federal prosecutors already handled. So constitutionally speaking, New York is totally in the clear. But here's the catch. The defense is arguing that New York's own laws offer way broader protection than the Constitution, and that the federal plea should immediately trigger a dismissal. They're basing this on New York's Criminal Procedure Law, Section 40.20. It's a state law specifically designed to prevent successive prosecutions for the same or closely related conduct. Now, Justice Carrió actually looked at this exact argument back in 2025, but ruled it was premature because Mangione hadn't yet pleaded guilty federally. Well, as of August 14, 2026, he has. The trigger has been pulled. So now Justice Carrió has to decide if this specific New York law, or one of its exceptions, will legally force the state to drop its entire murder case.
Section 5. The Pennsylvania charges. The arrest-related case.
Before we map out the final timeline, we absolutely have to touch on a third jurisdiction, the Blair County Court of Common Pleas in Pennsylvania. It's crucial to note that these pending local charges are strictly related to his arrest, not to Thompson's death, and they currently have no verified 2026 court dates. Mangione was arrested in Altoona, Pennsylvania back in December 2024, which is what spawned these separate charges. There was a bit of a procedural dispute in October 2025 over Mangione's availability for a hearing, which resulted in some defense requests being dismissed without prejudice. But this case is completely separate from the homicide prosecutions. It just remains on its own, highly delayed track.
Finally, Section 6. What happens next? The legal horizon. So the real question is figuring out how these overlapping schedules are going to play out over the coming months. We've got 3 jurisdictions, but really 2 major dates dominating the calendar. First, we have the August 14th federal guilty plea, which immediately sparked that New York dismissal motion. Then, we look ahead to September 8, 2026. This was the date officially scheduled for the start of the New York trial. But, and this is a massive but, while the federal sentencing is completely locked in for December 18th, that September 8th New York trial date is purely contingent on how Justice Carrió rules on the pending dismissal motion. If the judge agrees with the defense that New York's successive prosecution laws apply, that September 8th trial just doesn't happen. The case is dismissed. If he rules for the prosecution, the trial moves forward.
I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder as we wait for the court's decision on the real limits of state versus federal power. Will a federal guilty plea effectively close the book on a state murder trial? Or will New York State assert its right as an independent sovereign to have the absolute final word in front of a Manhattan jury? What do you think will happen?